We're happy to have Saul Wilson from Ashoka University with us here today to speak about China. His presentation is titled, as you can see, The Landlord State, Land Allocation as a Tool of Industrial Policy in China. And we often use China as a comparator to understand India's urbanization story and sort of compare and contrast. And that's always a fun way to try and make sense of what's happening. So we're very eager to hear from you, Saul, and I'll hand over to you. And sorry to the Zoom folks for leaving you out of the banter in the beginning. And Happy New Year again, yes.
Thank you, Mukta, for the introduction, and thank you especially for the invitation. I'm going to talk today about how China uses land as a tool for industrial policy, but in particular about how the Chinese state built up the capacity to do that. And I'm especially excited to do this with an Indian audience and with an audience of people who know Indian urban development so well, because I know essentially nothing about Indian urban development. And my hope is that through
it's mine that is giving trouble.
So my hope is that through this presentation and through the conversation that follows, we can develop a little bit of an understanding of a comparison between China and India. And certainly Mukta and Partha already have the beginnings of that themselves. I'm not sure if I have control over this PowerPoint, but the keyboard doesn't do anything. I already tried that.
Can you make it bigger?
Yeah.
I think, is it open on your screen there, or whose screen is it open on?
It's on my screen. I'll do it.
But I'll keep talking while we try and sort this out. So the presentation today, I'll begin by talking about how what the Chinese government's goal was in creating a landlord state, what they hoped to do by getting control over land allocation. And then I'll talk a little bit about how they got control over urban land in particular. And then finally, I'll talk about the type of industrial policy that they used the landlord state tool for. So do we have control now, or I think? All right, well, it's getting bigger.
I'm not able to control it from here for some reason.
Can you control it from over there, or?
Yeah.
All right, so we could probably do without the PowerPoint. So the concept here of a landlord state is essentially one in which the state has control over, has a monopoly over land supply, and is able to use this in furtherance of industrial policy. And when I talk about industrial policy here, what I'm talking about is a systematic state effort to promote or attract investment and economic activity to certain sectors of the economy. So this involves, in the Chinese case, and in particular in the attempt to use land to do this, it requires the state have physical control over land. This is probably more distracting to watch the PowerPoint than.
Yeah, I don't know why, but for some reason when it goes into.
All right, do we have? All right, so I think 2 slides. Yeah, 2 more slides. And 1 more. Yeah. So in order to actually allocate land to urban land users, in order to allocate it to some sort of industrial use, the land first has to be taken by the government, and then the government has to go on and allocate it onto some sort of end user. And so this is quite a substantial undertaking here. The government has to be able to extract land, from villages and from villagers, and it has to be able then to ensure that the land gets into the hands of the end users that it wants to support. Next slide. And so the process that I'll talk about today is first what the underlying logic was that prompted the desire to have a national policy of state-owned urban land. We had that working for a moment. Okay. So,
I think so. At least it worked there, so you can figure out whether it worked. No? No.
well, I'll keep talking about this.
You have to do this.
So,
You keep
so-
talking.
Yeah, that works. So, okay, so I'll begin by talking about how the desire to support industrial policy led to a national policy of creating a landlord state. But then how, in particular, I'll talk about how that entailed a significant amount of state building in order to create the state capacity necessary to take and allocate land in support of industrial policy. And then I'll shift gears and talk a little bit about a particular industrial policy that this landlord state was used as a tool to support, and that is the promotion of the real estate sector starting in the late 1990s. And I'll argue that that particular industrial policy created a very potent growth coalition, a growth coalition that was so potent that it was able to exert sufficient societal pressure that it essentially captured the industrial policy agenda and was able to use this tool of industrial policy, the landlord state, to support the real estate sector instead of supporting the broader program of industrial policy that the Chinese state proposed at various different time periods. Next slide. So to begin, we should talk a little bit about what the origins of the landlord state are. At the end of the Mao era, as China was transitioning towards reform and opening, urban land was not fully under state ownership. The bulk of urban land would have been owned by state-owned enterprises and by municipal governments that had large housing holdings, but there was still some urban land that was held by private citizens. And rural land, on the other hand, was held by rural collectives. It had been initially redistributed to individual peasants and households through rural land reform, but starting in the 1950s, it was then collectivized and was largely managed out of the rural collective. And so in the Mao era, land both in the cities and in the countryside was relatively dispersed. Land ownership was relatively dispersed. And as reform and opening began in 1978 and then picked up pace in the early 1980s, probably the best term to describe what's happening broadly in the economy is a period of directional liberalism. And this is borrowing from Huang Yasheng's work on the early reform period. And so there isn't clear, strong property rights at this point, but there's a sense that the broader economy, that the broader society is moving towards a more liberal economic system, and people are willing to start engaging in private commerce, willing to start using markets to trade goods, including land. And so we start to see the emergence of a bit of a land market in the early 1980s. And this early land market is quite offensive to the state entities that are tasked with building the economy. So we have state-owned enterprises, but we also have the military and various other government organs who, throughout the Mao era and into the 1980s, see themselves as the stewards of national industrial policy. And as the beginnings of a land market begin to emerge, as the price of land begins to go up, when they try and engage in industrial projects, they find that they have to spend more and more money to take the land. And they think that this is really at odds with their task, and it's certainly at odds with their institutional interests. And so it's these state-owned enterprises and representatives of government entities and the military who are involved in the drafting of the 1982 constitutional revisions. And in the process of drafting this, they advocate for nationalizing all land in China. They don't quite get what they want. What they get instead is that urban land will be state-owned. So this quilt work of state-owned enterprises and local governments and private citizens who own urban land is simplified to simply state ownership. And rural land is formally put under the ownership of rural collectives. So into the hands of these collectives that were established in the 1950s. Next slide. Of course, none of this is so easy to implement in practice. Because land was not the primary tool of managing the economy under the planned economy, instead, of course, the planned economy was managed through allocations of products and not land itself, the reformers didn't inherit a particularly developed system for managing land. In fact, they inherit a system in which there are very few cadastral maps even. They don't really know who has ownership or use of different parcels of land in cities. And they have relatively weak tools over which to control land use. The historical way under the planned economy to control land use was simply, you don't have the materials through the planned economy to build a factory, then you obviously aren't going to be building a factory. But once you have the materials, then you are supported by the plan and you should be allowed to build this factory. And so this is not a system that comes in with strong land management institutions. And moreover, this new constitution that's just been adopted is not particularly clear about what state ownership or collective ownership means. In the countryside, it's not clear whether the collective is the brigade, the small group, or the village, or the township. These are all levels at which under Mao accounting had been conducted, and it's really unclear who is supposed to own the land in the countryside now. And in the cities, it's particularly unclear. Does state ownership mean that the national government will exercise ownership over every parcel of land in the country? Does it mean that local governments will do it? Or, as these state-owned enterprises who drafted the Constitution want to believe that it means, does it mean that state-owned enterprises, which have state in the name, are going to be the de facto owners of land? And so it's very unclear how they're going to implement this type of state land ownership, and it's unclear if they can even pull it off with the institutions that they have. And moreover, it's a little unclear how relevant this really is to the economy. The state-owned enterprises perhaps think that they are particularly relevant to industrial policy, but the primary locus of industrial growth at this point is not in the cities, it's rather in the countryside. It's under the development of township and village enterprises, which are being supported by these collective enterprises, or by these collectives in the countryside. And they already have control over their own land. They had it to begin with. And so this constitutional amendment it's not at all clear that this will be particularly useful for industrial policy. Next slide. So it's a challenge to implement the system, and it's unclear how much good it's going to do for for industrial policy overall. And it's particularly a challenge because the institutional arrangement in which this system is initiated is one in which the government is largely standing on the sidelines of the urban development process. The way that land takings and allocation works in the 1980s is that an end user, that is a state-owned enterprise or a local government, or in some cases even a real estate developer, will seek out a village and bargain with them to take their land. And this is, of course, a very political bargaining process. It's not a purely economic one, but it's one in which stronger villages are able to extract relatively good deals from state-owned enterprises, and one in which stronger state-owned enterprises are able to extract relatively good deals from villages. And so there is a significant amount of horse trading going on, and there's a reasonable opportunity for villages in some cases to do pretty well off of this land takings process, which of course means that the government isn't playing much of an active role in land allocation. It isn't using its nominal ownership over land and the urbanization of land in order to support industrial policy. Rather, what the government is doing is organizing this bargaining and then signing off on the deal that they make. Often it signs off on one version of the deal, and the actual version that is implemented is the second version that is perhaps more generous. Next slide. So how do we get from a system in which villages are bargaining essentially directly with end users and the government is standing on the sideline to one in which the state, in particular the government, is playing a very active role in taking and allocating land? Next slide. Well, in the 1980s, the state, in particular local governments, don't have much motivation to change anything at all. Part of the 1982 constitutional amendment is that the trading of land is forbidden. It's illegal for whoever has the land in their hands to engage in renting it to anybody else. It's illegal to sell it. And so if a local government manages to play a significant role in the land takings process, it manages to interpose itself between the village and the end user, what can it possibly gain from this? Well, it's not able to sell or rent the land to the end user for a profit. The best it can do is charge the end user the price it cost to take the land in the first place. So the government can provide the service of taking the land. It's not clear to the government why they would want to do this. And so the government has very little incentive to engage in land takings and to use land for industrial policy. Instead, what local governments have an incentive to do and what state-owned enterprises have an incentive to do is to claim land for their own purposes. State-owned enterprises already control a large portion of urban areas in China at this point. They have large work units with walls around them. And from the perspective of local governments, this means local governments don't control a large chunk of the territory that is within their jurisdiction. So local governments would like to try and freeze out state-owned enterprises, while state-owned enterprises would like to expand their land holdings. So much of the 1980s is a competition between these two representatives of the state. Local governments try and find ways to build and then sell the final product, sell housing or the like to state-owned enterprises, but state-owned enterprises also try and find ways to get more land themselves. Next slide. Things really begin to change in 1987 and 1988. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see why, which is that, next slide, which is that Shenzhen launches an auction for urban land. They do this before it's legal, but they do it with the support of the national government. And this suddenly changes the role that local governments play from being asked to organize land takings or perhaps provide land at cost or even at a loss to state-owned enterprises and other industrial actors, to one in which local governments can make a profit by taking land and flipping it to end users. And so it's through the change to the land trading rules in 1987, 1988 that this nationalization of urban land finally means something to local governments. Local governments have an incentive to realize the national ownership of urban land and to do it in their own name as local governments and not allow state-owned enterprises to lay claim to urban land. Next. So local governments can sell their own land. They can use the money they they can use the money they make from selling land to cross-subsidize certain land allocation to less lucrative projects. So that is, they can sell land to a real estate developer at a very high price, and then they can allocate land at a low price to an industrial actor. And so finally, local governments have the ability to use land. They can financially afford to use land in support of industrial policy, and they have some motivation to do so, which is that they might be able to make a profit in the process. But they're limited in how much they can do this. There's still competing sources of land supply. You still have large state-owned enterprises in cities that are illegally selling their land to real estate developers as well. And that prevents local governments from selling land at high prices. Even the local governments themselves are competing within the local government. You'll have different offices within the same government trying to sell land. That also drives down land prices. So in one particularly famous case, Beijing attempts to auction off land. They think they'll make some money from this process, and nobody shows up to buy land at the auction. They sit down and they think about it over the next few days, and they realize that the Beijing municipal government has just come back from Hong Kong, where they went door to door to all of the developers in Hong Kong and asked them if they wanted land, and if they did, they gave it to them essentially for free. And so there was no longer any market left for buying land at auction because everybody who wanted it already had a piece of land. And so it's very hard to get this process moving. Local governments are in the habit of giving away land for free. Local officials are in the habit of giving away land in exchange for bribes, and nobody really has much motivation to sell it at high prices to support an industrial policy of cheap land allocation. Next. So I'll argue that there are three big policy changes, reforms that occur between 1998 and 2005 that allow local governments, and in fact, ultimately force local governments into the role of taking land at low prices from villagers and then allocating it on in support of their industrial policy. The first of these is a significant reform to the land takings process, in which the compensation granted to villagers is pushed down. The second is a significant reform to the financial system, which results in local governments needing to mortgage their land holdings in order to borrow, and then in turn needing to sell their land in order to repay the loans. And then thirdly, there is an order from the central government that local governments need to sell land at high prices for the real estate sector. And that ultimately forces local governments to go into the business of profiting off of selling land. So I'll talk in a little bit more detail about each of these. Next slide. So the first is this question of land takings. So you'll recall that in order for this landlord state to work, the government needs to be able to allocate land onto these end users. And in order to do that, it has to acquire land from villagers. And so you need, in the context of this picture here, you need to be able to go from the farm fields in the foreground to these new high rises in the background. The government needs to be able to take the farm fields and allocate them on to a real estate developer. And in order for the state to be able to act as a landlord state, in order for the state to be able to do this in support of its own industrial policy, that land has to transit the government on the way between being in villager hands and real estate developers' hands. Next. And so in 1998, there's a significant reform to the land takings process. Previously, as I described earlier, you have local governments organizing bargaining between the end users and the villages. Starting in 1998, the rules change. They learn from what Shanghai has been doing since the early 1990s, and they say that only local governments can actually engage in land takings. So state-owned enterprises and real estate developers and the like can no longer bargain directly with villages. Only the local government can do this. And the way in which the local government is to interact with them has also changed. The word bargaining is removed, and instead the local government is to inform the village of how much compensation it will receive, and the villagers are to report to the local government to collect their compensation. So this is a way of forcing down compensation. It's also a process in which they remove what had previously been an important component of the compensation, where people would be allocated jobs, either in state-owned enterprises or in collective enterprises, as compensation. Instead, they are given purely monetary compensation. They're given more monetary compensation than they used to be, but they're no longer given this long-term commitment to employment. And this is packaged as a realistic reform. The socialist planned economy is no longer in place. They're no longer really able to allocate jobs, and people should be seeking jobs on the private market. But the main takeaway from this is that this simply pushes down the cost of taking land and allows local governments to do it by fiat instead of having to engage in extensive bargaining with villages. Next. At the same time, in response to the Asian financial crisis, Zhu Rongji, the then premier, launches a series of reforms to the financial system. At this point, local governments have essentially been using bank deposits as a form of local government financing. The banking system in the 1980s and early 1990s is organized into local bank branches. So it's essentially, they're centrally owned banks, but the local bank branch managers are appointed by local governments. And the local governments can always threaten to change the bank manager if the bank manager doesn't provide an attractive loan arrangement to the local government. And so local governments are essentially able to borrow off of their local bank deposits to support whatever enterprise the local government wants to engage in. Zhurongji eliminates this opportunity by centralizing control over personnel within the banking system. And so banks suddenly become very interested in receiving collateral in exchange for their loans, which is not something that they had been asking for previously. And what collateral do local governments have to offer? Well, local governments are not particularly profitable enterprises at this point, but what they do have is they have land. In particular, they have nominal ownership over state land as a result of the 1982 constitutional reforms and a series of policies that have been issued since then. But in order to actually use land as collateral, they have to commit to taking the land, and then they have to commit to selling the land, because otherwise there's really no way in which they could return the bank loan. And so this is the beginning of the process of land finance, in which local governments borrow against land, but it's also the beginning of widespread land banking, in which local governments establish institutions to take land from villagers, to prepare it for sale, to clean the land, make sure that it not only has clean title, but has good roads, is got decent infrastructure, and is prepared to be sold at the highest price the local government can get. And so this is a big motivation for local governments to get into the business of land development. But they still drag their feet about selling land at high prices. They drag their feet because local officials are often engaged in quite lucrative corrupt deals with real estate developers, where the real estate developers, instead of paying the local government for the land, pay the individual official in charge of allocating the land. And then the official charges a very low official price for the land. But starting in the early 2000s, if we go to the next slide, we see the national government forcing local governments to sell land at auction. This is something that they have called for almost a decade, but nobody has been listening. And they call for it again in the early 2000s, and again, nobody listens. But then the central government loses its patience. It declares that this is a matter of party discipline. It says that anybody caught selling land not through auction to a real estate developer for residential or commercial use will be presumed to be corrupt. And that, of course, doesn't work either. And so they have to send work teams down to every locale to keep an eye on them while they start selling land at auction. That, though, does work, and local governments start to sell land at much, much higher prices in the early mid-2000s. So there's a vast increase in the price that local governments are charging for land, because they're now selling it at auction and they're acting as monopoly land sellers. They're trying to actually get the best of the price that the market will bear. Next. So as a result of these three reforms, we see a big incentive for the government to place itself in the middle of these land transactions. We see the government expropriating land from villages as a result of its newfound powers from land takings reform. We see it able to finance this because it's now taking out loans that are collateralized with land. And then we see it allocating that land on to end users and doing it in a relatively strategic way. Next slide. And the strategic approach that it settles on is one in which it provides cheap land for industrial undertakings. It provides cheap land for factories, because factories will simply go to other cities if you don't give them cheap enough land. But then they adopt a much more interesting approach for real estate. Real estate at this point is one of the central pillars of national industrial policy. Starting in 1980, Deng Xiaoping has begun talking about real estate as a potential pillar of industrial policy. He comes back from a trip to the United States and to Japan, and he says that capitalist countries have managed to make it profitable to engage in construction and to build housing, and we here in China are somehow or another managing to lose money in the process of building housing, we should really learn how to make it a profitable business. In particular, he finds that capitalist countries have real estate as a major sector of their economy. And he thinks that that's a possibility for the Chinese as well. So he pushes for making real estate a major sector of the economy. And his push for real estate, in particular for housing reform, languishes for about 15 or 20 years. But again, in response to the Asian financial crisis, Zhu Rongji sees real estate as a potential way to promote consumption. He sees real estate as something that people might be willing to spend money on, and so thereby to improve the economy. And so he wants to push real estate as a new central sector of the industrial policy for China. And so starting in 1998, he forces everybody to start buying houses on the market. He forbids state-owned enterprises from allocating housing as part of their compensation packages. And so he pushes real estate into the center of industrial policy. And local governments very quickly realize, and the central government does as well, that real estate is a unique industry in which higher land costs don't drive off investment. In fact, higher land costs attract investment because it makes real estate look like a better investment for the individual home buyer. And so local governments realize that they can use very expensive land sales from real estate to cross-subsidize these cheap land allocations for industry. They don't have to charge much when they give land to industry, but they can charge quite a bit to real estate developers and use that to pay for the cost of expropriating land for industry. Next slide. And so this combines to result in a huge amount of revenue from land sales. So this is the ratio of land sales revenue to on-budget tax revenue, tax and fee revenue. Unfortunately, you can't see the years at the bottom of this, but if you could, what you would see is that there's essentially no money coming from land in the 1980s. Starting around 1992, there's a noticeable uptick in the ratio of revenue from land sales to tax revenues, but then it falls back down through the course of the latter half of the 1990s and only rises precipitously in the early 2000s, around the time the central government is forcing local governments to sell land at auction. And it eventually reaches the point where through much of the 2000s and into the 2010s, local governments are pulling in about half as much land from land sales as they are from taxes and fees. And of course, much of the tax revenue itself is coming from land transaction taxes. So in many of these cities, about half of total revenue is coming from land-related revenue sources. So local governments are, of course, very fond of this arrangement. Not only does it provide them with a certain amount of leverage to engage in industrial policy, they can afford to provide cheap land to industrial land users to support their industrial investments, but they can also earn an enormous amount of money from selling land. Next slide. So local governments are a key part of this real estate growth coalition. They're more than happy to support the real estate sector. Of course, real estate developers are also quite happy to engage in selling houses because local governments are pushing up the price of land, and that means that housing prices are also going up rapidly, and real estate developers can profit from these rising housing prices. And homeowners are more than happy to join this growth coalition as well, because they've often been given very cheap housing as part of the housing reform that occurred in the 1990s, and now they can watch the house prices rise while they already have a house in their hands. So there are only two notable groups of losers here. We have people who haven't yet bought houses and might want to buy them. And we have peri-urban villagers. We have the people on the edge of the city who are being expropriated to support this growth coalition. Next slide. And these peri-urban villagers resist fiercely. They are not happy to discover that their land is extremely valuable and that they're given a pittance in compensation. They start to file petitions with local government and then national government demanding higher compensation. They launch protests, and they even engage in riots. So if we go to the next slide, you can see one of the more famous riots from Guangzhou. This is as part of the land clearance project for the Guangzhou University town. Guangzhou is a city that's famous for being relatively generous with its villagers, but at exactly this moment, in keeping with national policy, it decides to try out being a little less generous. It decides that it really should provide less compensation to these villagers. It shouldn't give them land in exchange for their land. It should instead give them jobs or simply a house and the opportunity to go find a job on their own. And the villagers don't like this. They riot. They even go so far as to steal the official stamps of the land takings team. And the police are sent in to repress the riot. The land is taken, but the compensation agreement is rearranged in a way that is slightly more favorable to the villagers, but still much, much less generous than what villages in Guangzhou were receiving in the early 1990s. And so this broad package of national reforms has had its desired effect. It's lowered the cost of land takings, and it's allowed local governments to use these land takings to support favored projects like building a university town. Next. But this creates massive political problems. It creates massive political problems that have been in the makings for almost a decade at this point, where local governments have been charging very high taxes on rural citizens. And this results in significant protests and riots in rural areas related to taxes. And when the new government of Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao takes office in 2002, 2003, one of their central political goals is to promote more pro-rural policies. And they're intensely concerned about the political ramifications of these protests and riots in rural areas. When it comes to taxes, they solve the problem relatively directly by simply eliminating rural taxes. The economy is at this point sufficiently urban that they can afford to do this. They're not losing much revenue for the national government, and all they do is wind up having to provide transfer payments to rural governments to keep them afloat. But they can't take quite such a simplistic approach on land takings, because part of creating this economic powerhouse in urban areas is that they need to be able to continue to take land. They need the land on which to build. And so it's in this environment that the central government pushes local governments to provide higher and higher compensation, but does so while continuing to allow them to take land. Next slide. And the central government meets a modicum of success here. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to get reliable data, or frankly, any data at all, on the share of land revenue, the share of land sale value that goes to the villagers who were originally on the land. But the central government for several years in the late 2000s and early 2010s did publish national level statistics on this. So from local level statistics, it appears that it was probably around 5 or 10% in the early 2000s. This is a very low share of total land revenue that is going to the original people on the land. But by 2007, the central government has given local governments a reasonable amount of pressure to provide higher compensation. And so despite land values themselves rising very rapidly, the compensation being provided to villagers is now up to about 30% of total land revenue. And that rises even further in the course of the 2000s to something north of 50% by around 2012 or 2013. So this is a noticeable increase in compensation. It's certainly a noticeable enough increase that local governments feel it. Next slide. And it's a noticeable enough increase that, at least in Guangzhou, these villagers can tell the difference as well. This is a village in Guangzhou celebrating that its land has been taken, because it's now getting much, much better compensation than it was in the early 2000s when well, the post-land takings village. Yes, but this is after it's been redeveloped. So yeah, but these villagers are quite happy to have their land taken, because they now get quite generous compensation. And people who refuse to have their land taken are sometimes treated with excessively gentle kid gloves. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see a highway in Guangzhou where rather than deal with the politics of demolishing this fellow, they simply have left him and his house in the middle of the highway, built a little tunnel under the highway so that he can get in, and he's now something of a tourist attraction. So the overall approach to land takings shifts dramatically over the course of the late 2000s and into the early 2010s, and it draws peri-urban villagers into this broader growth coalition in favor of real estate development. So if we go to the next slide. So of course, peri-urban villagers are not delighted to have their land taken at any price. They want the highest price possible, and so they'll still complain bitterly in land takings. But as part of this process, they will often seek out the local government, ask them to take their land, and as soon as the local government shows up at their doorstep, they will start bargaining for a higher price. And so peri-urban villagers are now very much part of this growth coalition, even if they are obviously seeking a higher share of the price. Next. So what could possibly go wrong here? Well, the growth coalition has, by this point, grown to a size that is relatively difficult to resist, and it gets significant support from the central government in 2008, 2009. As in the early to mid 2000s, the central government is constantly trying to put the brakes on the real estate sector. It allows it to grow, and then it says maybe it's time to cool down a little, and then it allows it to grow a little bit more. But starting during the 2008 global financial crisis, the central government realizes that they're in a real pinch. There's declining demand for China's exports. And so they really need to find some sector of the economy that can grow and make up for that declining export demand. And what they settle on is the real estate sector and urban development. So the central government provides significant financing to support local governments engaged in land clearance and infrastructure building. And the central government provides support for the real estate sector. It lowers taxes on real estate, it lowers the barriers to buying a house, and encourages everybody to go out and buy houses. And the result is that the price of houses nearly doubles in the year after the global financial crisis hits. And the real estate sector becomes really the center of the economy, to some extent to the exclusion of much of the industry that had been supported in the early 2000s as part of this tool of allocating land at high cost to real estate and then subsidizing industry for subsidizing the export sector or subsidizing more productive industry. Instead, what happens is that land is sold at high prices to real estate, and then those high prices are used to subsidize infrastructure development. So it's a very different model that develops in the wake of the global financial crisis. This means, of course, that local government borrowing against land increases, which is what they're using all this credit from the central government for. And everybody begins to see that local governments can't afford for the real estate sector to fail. And so there is something of an implied government guarantee on the real estate sector. And that means that housing is the single most attractive investment in the country. Everybody knows that it's tied up with the fate of the government, and so you might as well invest in housing. Next. Next slide. There, maybe.
Not moving? Resharing. Okay.
Yeah, so I think that probably makes the most sense. So at this point, we have local governments, we have home buyers, we have real estate developers, and we have peri-urban villagers all very eagerly engaged in the real estate trade. But we still have people outside of the city who are trying to move in, who are losing out in this process. And we have a central government that's getting increasingly nervous that its local governments are highly dependent on land sales and land borrowing. And we have a central government that's increasingly concerned about the large number of people who would like to move into cities who simply can't afford to. They see this as a potential risk to the broader urbanization process in which the central government hopes to promote consumption by increasing the rate of urbanization. So next slide. And so the central government launches a series of strategies to reduce the dependence of local governments and the economy more broadly on real estate. The first of these is launched in 2010. This is only a year and a half after the central government has promoted the real estate sector and very successfully gotten the real estate sector to grow by leaps and bounds in response to the global financial crisis. And now the central government tries to cool down the real estate sector. It limits how many houses people can buy. It limits their access to mortgages. And in the process, it hopes to restrain housing prices. And it does so with some success, at least in Beijing, in 2010 and 2011. But by 2012, they start to reduce their restrictions on the real estate sector, and the real estate sector starts to grow rapidly again. And the next time the central government gets involved in 2014, the central government tries a different tack, which is to reform the local government financing system. The central government recognizes that it's really local governments that have the biggest interest in promoting the real estate sector because local governments are dependent on land sales for revenue, and then they're using that revenue to repay loans that are mortgaged against land sales. And so this is really a system in which local governments can't afford to give up on land, and the central government thinks that maybe they should go through the reforms to local government financing to change this. And this is part of a broader project. Xi Jinping at this point is talking about a new normal in which the economy will grow more slowly and hopefully grow with less emphasis on urban development. And so local government financing reforms are a key part of this. And so they pass a new budget law in 2014, and they begin to shift investment away from urban development and towards the stock market. Then in 2015, the stock market goes up very, very rapidly and falls down very, very rapidly. And they return to promoting local government land-based finance. They send the central government's policy banks to provide generous loans to local governments in support of urban development, in support both of infrastructure and of housing for what are called shantytown redevelopment projects, although shantytowns are not particularly shanty. And as a result, they push the real estate sector into yet another upswing. If we go to the next slide, you can see how in the wake of 2015, there's yet another big uptick in housing starts, and a little before that in housing sales. The housing starts are the red line here. And so as the central government's stimulus efforts in response to 2015 start to take hold in late 2015, early 2016, you start to see a recovery of housing starts. And you start to see a sufficient recovery that the central government again gets nervous about housing prices. And now the central government tries yet another approach to reining in the real estate sector. This is one that begins to chip away at real estate developers' profits. What they do is, instead of simply restricting how many houses people can buy, they set price caps on houses. And in putting price controls on houses, they of course create an excess supply for what is a very, very large demand. And so people are forced to buy houses through a lottery system. Real estate developers are told to organize lotteries for each housing development, and people can then enter the lottery and pay the government price for the house. This means that real estate developers that were expecting to benefit from ever rising housing prices discover that the housing prices are no longer rising quite as fast as they had hoped. And so it puts a bit of a pinch on their bottom lines. And it, of course, also creates great enthusiasm for buying houses because everybody thinks they can buy a house at below market price simply by entering a lottery. And so everybody wants to do this. Everybody can see that secondhand houses are more valuable than firsthand houses. And so there's a big incentive to enter the lottery. And this supports demand for housing. And so this keeps the real estate sector going until 2020 or 2021, at which point the central government launches a much more severe crackdown on real estate developers. And at this point, what they do is they actually cut off financing for heavily leveraged real estate developers. Well, essentially any right-minded real estate developer at this point was heavily leveraged. They're well aware that there's high demand for housing in the Chinese economy, that people perceive housing prices to be essentially guaranteed by the government. They would be foolish not to invest in housing. And so local governments are more than, so real estate developers are more than happy to buy land heavily leveraged purchases in order to ultimately sell the houses at relatively high prices. And they're confident that those prices will be continuing to rise. But all of a sudden, the central government says you can't engage in this game. You can't be so heavily leveraged. And that pushes many of these real estate developers into default. Pushes them into default, it of course undermines confidence in the real estate market. At the same time that the COVID restrictions in 2022 also begin to keep people at home and undermine economic activity in 2022 and thereby constrain people's demand for housing in the first place. And so we can see from this that in 2022, the demand for housing and housing starts simply fall off a cliff. And we see very, very rapid declines in housing demand and housing supply in 2022. So that brings us pretty much up to the present. We go to the next slide. And so the broader pattern here is one in which the Chinese state set up a landlord state in which it intermediated these land transactions in order to support its industrial policy. It wanted to be in a position to allocate land to industries that it favored, and to do this in order to fit broader national goals. And it set real estate as one of those main broader national goals. It wanted to build up the real estate sector. And real estate then essentially captured this system, used the system to support almost exclusively further real estate development, and pushed aside much of the industrial development that had previously been part of this tool of land allocation. And that's beginning to change back now that the Chinese government has cracked down on real estate. Now that real estate is no longer so lucrative, local governments are frantically trying to find industrial projects that will at least pay some taxes. And so local governments are once again starting to use this landlord state tool in support of broader industrial policy, like supporting electric car manufacturing and the like. Next slide. But then, of course, there's also some yes, this is my last slide.
I thought you had an example of
No, I'm not going to go on that. So this landlord state is then a broader example of a tool that governments can use. Governments in other countries and in China as well often use capital in this way. They take capital through financial repression from people who have small amounts of savings, and then they reallocate it in support of industrial policy. And this is essentially the same thing going on but for land. We see the state using its ability to expropriate land at low prices and then to allocate it to the end users it wants to see supported as a primary tool of supporting its industrial policy. And so this landlord state concept is probably useful beyond just China. So I'll stop there. Apologies for going over, and look forward to your questions and comments and criticisms.
Well, we had a bunch of interruptions in the beginning, so it was fine. I think let's open the floor up for everyone who's here. There isn't anyone online right now, but folks on Zoom, please raise your hands, and I'm keeping track, and I'll bring you in to ask the question. Until then, people in the room, it's open to you. We can apply. No, yeah, sure. Can I just?
Thank you.
Folks on Zoom.
Thank you, Saul, for your excellent presentation with a few interruptions as well. My name is Ravi Bothalingam from Institute of Chinese Studies. This area is not my field, so my questions may seem very naive and kind of basic. I presume that this strategy gave the Chinese government much greater revenue to invest in capital through the model you described of supporting industry than the alternative policy of raising money through conventional income taxes and other forms of taxes. And is this the reason why they were able to maintain a very, very high rate of industrial growth for those 30 years? That is question number one. Question number two is, since they were predominantly focusing on peri-urban land, because that's the most useful, right? Because it's easily bordering the urban areas and can be taken. This is a finite quantity. I mean, there isn't an infinite amount of peri-urban land. So they must have known that this kind of thing cannot go on forever. I mean, it's not difficult to work out. So what is the, I mean, how did these folk think about this? I mean, is this a model that can go on? Or was there some sort of system to say, okay, we will phase it down at a certain stage or something? That's these two questions.
All right. The mic is in front of you. If you could just put it on and introduce yourself and ask. No, just press the button on top and it'll turn green, hopefully.
Okay, okay. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor. That was a very enlightening lecture. And my name is Shruti. I am from Center for Social and Economic Progress. And I have two questions again. Economics is not my forte. So you mentioned that the government undertook several reforms in the 1990s and then 2000s also. One of the major reforms that led to local governments being dependent on land sale was the 1994 fiscal reforms. So I don't know what is the status of that system. Are the local governments, what is the share between the central and the local government of taxes? Is there any policy reform which would reduce dependence of local governments on land? The second question that I have is that since you mentioned that it is an important way to control or shape state-society relations, could you comment on the issue of the hukou system? Because here, on the one hand, there is this need for people to move to urban areas, but there are two restrictions, one being the increased house prices and the second being that you can't move. So what has been the government response to both of these? Thank you so much.
Saul, why don't you take these? There are a couple and then we'll move online after
Okay.
you respond.
That's good. So I'll start with Struthi's questions here. The 1994 fiscal reforms are a very popular explanation for the origins of land finance, but I don't think that they're a correct one. I don't know if we can get the slides back, or that may be more work than it's worth, but there are, if we look at the ratio of land revenue to local government tax and fee revenue, it is the graph, it should be way back. Keep going back and I'll tell you when to stop. If we look at the ratio of land revenue, so land sales revenue to local government on budget tax and fee revenue, it does not go up after 1994. It actually falls after 1994 because there's a big bubble in the real estate market in 1992 to 1994 that gets burst. And then in the late 1990s, there's essentially very, very low revenue from land sales going to local governments. Local governments don't engage in high value or high contract value land transactions, in part because in the early 1990s, there isn't that much demand. Real estate doesn't begin to take off until 1998 when you have the housing reform, the previous slide that's got a graph on it. And then the other main reason, and this is, I think, the more important reason, the more important reason is that local government officials are selling that local government officials are selling land for personal profit. So you see the first peak there on the left. That's actually, I think, 1993 or 1990. That's 94, yeah. And then the share of local government revenue that's coming from land falls after 1994, and it doesn't go up again until the early 2000s. And one explanation here is that there's a little bit more tax reform that goes on in the early 2000s. I don't buy this. It's a comparatively small tax reform that goes on in the early 2000s. What happens in the early 2000s is that local governments are told that they can't sell land on the side through bargained land sales. They have to do it at auction. And this prevents local officials from engaging in corrupt land bargains. So I'm not at all convinced by the 1994 tax reform story. The hukou system question is quite interesting and quite complicated. The hukou system is initially used, in fact, as a way to encourage people to buy houses. The idea being that if you buy a house in our city, then we will give you hukou. And so this is a way of drumming up business for the real estate sector. And so when land values are going up rapidly, when local governments are particularly eager to bring in more home buyers, they use this as a tool to attract investment. But when the central government starts to get concerned that local governments are making too much money off of land transactions, that the real estate sector is overheating, then and of course, the central government gets increasingly concerned about some of these large cities, particularly places like Beijing and Shanghai, simply getting too big. They turn things on their head and they say that only people with hukou can buy a house. And so the hukou system can be put to all sorts of different uses, depending on whatever the political goal of the day is. Did that answer your question about hukou? Or, yeah, it's a very, very popular one. So Robbie's question here about, one of these questions is also about the tax system. So is this more revenue than they would have gotten through income taxes? Certainly more than they would have gotten given the current income distribution in China, where income is a relatively small share of GDP. But more importantly, collecting income taxes is politically fraught. You have to deal with the entire population and you have to shake every individual down for their portion of taxes. And so this is a lot of dispersed interaction between the state and individuals. And that has risks for social stability, and it simply requires a huge state apparatus to implement. The land expropriation process is much more concentrated. You pick a village, you send some officials there this month, and you extract their land. And the worst that happens is you really upset the villagers in this village, but you don't upset the whole country. So from a political perspective, it is much easier to go about this type of very targeted process of taking resources from a select group of individuals. And it's one that requires less state building. It requires state building to engage in land takings, but it requires much more concentrated and limited state building. And so most Chinese taxes, especially those that are enforced, are not direct taxes. They're indirect taxes that go through corporations or the like. That doesn't really get to your broader question of would they have been able to maintain such high industrial growth without this system? They had pretty high industrial growth in the 1990s when what they were doing was depending on villages to perform much the same function. So villages are already relatively large landholders. And if a village decides to convert some of its farmland to factory land, it can still provide relatively large amounts of land to industrial developers. The problem for villages is that they can't provide regional scale infrastructure. And so what this system does is it allows local governments to finance regional scale infrastructure. And that's where this system has been particularly useful for the Chinese government. And it also has, of course, resolved what had been a long-standing and very problematic shortage of housing. This is an extraordinary accomplishment in that now Chinese citizens who 40 years ago were cramped into maybe an average of 3 or 4 square meters of urban housing per person now have more housing than they know what to do. This is really an accomplishment in some sense. It's just they may have overshot the mark a little. And then your second question about peri-urban land. In some sense, peri-urban land isn't that finite because once you've built a bigger city, you just have more land. You have more peri-urban, right? The Chinese government has probably ever since the Great Leap Forward been concerned that it won't be able to feed its population. And it's had moments where that concern gets particularly pronounced in the late 1990s and then again in the last couple of years. And in those moments, the fact that they're using up the most desirable agricultural land on the edge of cities is a real concern for them. But the bigger unsustainable component of this is simply that there aren't that many people to move into these cities. You can take much, much more land than you can populate. And that's where the government was certainly concerned, but the reason why I described the growth coalition that I described is that that growth coalition had a big interest in continuing to build houses, even if there wasn't demand, because local governments still had to pay back their land debt. Individuals still wanted their housing values to go up. And if that meant that a lot of people were buying houses that they never intended to live in, that didn't really bother anybody in this system as long as somebody else was willing to buy another house that they weren't going to live in. And so there were certainly people concerned about this. There were people concerned about it from well before it was an actual risk in the late 2000s when people were still living in relatively cramped housing conditions in many Chinese cities. People were already worried that they were overbuilding housing. But it took a while before that really percolated through the system and before people were willing to risk the golden goose that was producing such a vibrant economy in order to avoid the risk of a housing bubble.
Saul, actually, your comment segues. I'll just take Andrew's question. Andrew, you can actually unmute yourself, but he's essentially talking or addressing the parallels between what you've described and what's happening in India. Andrew, do you want to just talk through your question yourself? You can just unmute and speak. Go ahead.
Yeah, can you hear me?
We can.
Thanks. No, first of all, thanks so much. And I thought it would be interesting because I know some scholars of Indian urbanization are in the room. I thought it would be an interesting discussion because some of the things you mentioned sound quite similar to things already happening in India, particularly with the BDA in Bangalore, in the peripheral areas of Bangalore, and more recently, Sidco, which is in Navi Mumbai, is trying to sort of redo what it did for Navi Mumbai all those years ago. And so what it did for Navi Mumbai was it effectively bought up huge swaths of land around Mumbai and then effectively sold them off to people. And now there's talk about it happening all over again. So just this idea of the landlord state, I don't know if it's been particularly picked up in Indian urbanization literature. I know that we've been talking about speculative urbanism and peripheral urbanization and things like that. But I think this idea of the landlord state might become more relevant to start talking about some of these processes that we're seeing. And yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks, Andrew. Vikash, do you also want to come in? You can unmute yourself and ask. Vikash's question is largely about what the farmers feel and how they have received this kind of land acquisition, this kind of taking. Vikash, you can unmute yourself and speak. Vikash, are you there? Okay, I'll just read out his question. He asked, is land acquisition by the government causing dissatisfaction in farmers? Does compensation vary from place to place in China? And please mention about farmers' mobilization if it happens against this kind of forceful land acquisition. That's his question. Yeah, that's what we have from the online set.
So I'll start with Andrew's question or comment here. I don't know essentially anything about urbanization in India. I'm here to learn from you all about that, but I would venture that probably India is not quite a landlord state in the sense that China is. I think Michael Levine has a book in which he describes India as a land broker state. And the difference here being that the Chinese state is attempting to monopolize the supply of land. It's not simply trying to use it on a small scale. And so this is a pretty significant difference. But of course, you don't need to monopolize the supply of land in order to use it for industrial policy. But you do need to do it on a relatively large scale. And that's where I would need to hear from you all of whether India is doing it on a sufficiently large scale that it would count as being a real tool of industrial policy, and then whether it's being used for industrial policy or whether it's simply being used for government revenue or some other end. For Vikash's question about land acquisition causing dissatisfaction, of course it causes dissatisfaction. I think anywhere that you have land acquisition, you surely have dissatisfaction. One of the quirks of the Chinese urban development model is that it prefers to take large plots of land. It doesn't tend to take small individual parcels of land. It likes to take a whole village or several villages, build a new downtown, and then incorporate that whole large-scale development into the city. And this necessarily means that you will be including people who both want their land taken and people who don't. So it, just by virtue of the fact that you're changing people's lifestyles, no matter the compensation you provide, you will prompt dissatisfaction. And then if you provide low compensation, as they did in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, and some places continue to today, then you will, of course, have even more dissatisfaction and perhaps even universal dissatisfaction among villagers when compensation is very low. And in particular, villagers tend to get very annoyed when they see that the government has sold a parcel of land for, let's say, $100 million, and the villagers have received 10 million as compensation. And so that was often what was occurring in the late 1990s and early 2000s. Villagers mobilized in response to that. You saw the pictures of riots in Guangzhou, and those were not uncommon occurrences. And in response to those, and in response to in response to residents who refused to be demolished, and in response to pressure from the central government, you start to get higher compensation, but compensation is never going to reach the $100 million that the government is earning from the land sale itself, unless the government is willing to make a loss on the transaction, because the government also is investing money in the land. It's not only taking the land, but it's clearing the land, it's building roads, it's building schools, it's building subways, it's building sewers and water supply. So this is a large amount of investment that the government has to put in. And of course, it has to pay for the capital that it uses to do this before it's able to actually sell the land. And so from the perspective of local governments, they're in a bit of an awkward spot. They are constantly being pushed by villagers who want 100% or more of the land value, and local governments who are saying, well, we're actually contributing to the land value. And so this is where you start to see really dramatic local variation. That local variation has been in place since the beginning of time, but has been especially pronounced in some of these urban development projects where some local governments are now willing to make a loss on a redevelopment project, or they're willing to provide such high density to the real estate developer that villagers can get an enormous amount of compensation in the process. And then other local governments have been very strict and enforced consistent compensation standards since the late 1990s or the early 2000s. And those have provided much lower compensation and have insisted on doing so on the grounds that as soon as they start changing the compensation package, everybody who received compensation in earlier years will come back and demand that they get more, that they be made whole for what they lost in earlier years. And so the strategies of local governments vary quite dramatically as well.
Pushpa, you had a question, and anybody else in the room? Okay. So, all right, we'll take them all.
Well, my question is in relation to the comparative situation in India and China. What looks to me the Chinese model of land acquisition and real estate development is basically supply driven, irrespective of there's demand or not. And whereas in India, the real estate development is demand driven and still not able to meet demand for large proportion of population. So what does it end up in? Does it end up in housing surplus, empty houses? What does it look like? The end result of this real estate development in China. What does it look like in India? Is that in big cities, around large cities, yes, there has been this speculative real estate development. We do have empty houses, but at the same time, we have a lot of informal settlements with people without access to housing. So we have this dual kind of market situation. So what does it look like in China?
It looks exactly like what you just described.
Do they have informal settlements too?
So they do have informal settlements because they serve a very different sector of the population. They serve people without hukou who are coming to a city for temporary labor. They serve people who don't want to put that much money in a house. So people who were pessimistic about the real estate sector could go to an informal settlement and avoid having to gamble on the real estate market. And some of them are probably patting themselves on the back or wishing that they had invested in real estate and sold earlier. Then you have a very large supply of formal sector housing. And part of the goal here has been to incorporate more and more people into that formal sector housing. So the shantytown redevelopment projects that I alluded to were very explicitly to convert informal settlements, or in many cases, formal settlements that were simply old. The Chinese definition of an old house is now something that predates 2000, I think. The idea then was to demolish those old settlements, build much higher density housing where they once were, provide higher quality housing to the people who once lived in those, or at least the owners of those units, and then to have enough housing that more people could move into the city. And then, of course, there's an allocation question of who is it who's actually getting these new housing units. And this then becomes quite complicated. If it weren't for some of the policies that were put in place over the course of the 2010s that restricted the number of houses people could buy, it would be wildly off the charts, right? We would have individuals who had invested their entire savings in housings, and we would have very, very wealthy individuals who had done this. And so they would own dozens or hundreds of housing units. Instead, what we have is many middle-class families that own 3 or 4 housing units, thinking that they'll have a house for themselves, they have a house for their kid when their kid needs to get married, they have a house in the suburbs that they can rent out, and so on and so forth. They have an excuse for every house, but there's a limit to how many of these they can get because of the mortgage restrictions and because of the restrictions in some cities on how many houses an individual can own. And so you get a much more dispersed form of empty houses. But the exact share of houses that are empty versus being rented out is very, very hard to pin down.
I think Nitin and then. You had a question, right?
Thanks for the great talk. Yeah, it's on, I think. Thanks for the great talk. I'm Nitin Batla. From ETH Zurich, and I write about the infrastructure state. And it was interesting because I mean, one sees a lot of comparative comparison in like government literature on infrastructure, at least, like to catch up on sort of like infrastructure building, which somehow is used in India to drive access to land. So, I mean, you alluded to the fact that, I mean, the state was building infrastructure, like, you know, sort of laying down a network of roads in this sort of patches of land that are sort of put on land finance. But like, is there a large scale move to sort of open access to certain parts of like agricultural land, you know, to ingress into certain parts of the country, because your scale of analysis is national level? So like, have you done some analysis on like, where are these land parcels being opened? who's benefiting from it. Like, for instance, one sees in India a politics of caste operating on like where the first parcels of land are opened, and then like Sai Balakrishnan has written about it. Uh, do you see similar things in China, for instance, for East compared to the West? So, for instance, like is late development happening in Eastern China, for instance, to benefit from like urbanization that already took place in Western China in previous cycles? And also, like one sees in India, for instance, a policy of abandonment, like for instance, the Reliance MET, which was a very big sort of like model township, industrial township, that was abandoned for like 10-15 years, and now it is a real estate development instead of being an industrial one. And one sees a lot of this land conversion from industrial to real estate eventually. And like, how does that happen as a state process in China? You know, like, do they do that? Like, do they abandon and purposefully sort of develop it later? So yeah, these are the 3 questions I had from you.
You also want to pass the mic so we can add.
Hi, thank you for the talk. It was very interesting. My name is Gautam. I'm working here as a policy analyst in a think tank. So my question is more to do about housing rather than the state capacity. So here, there are a lot of parallels we can draw with what's happening in China and in India, because particularly like Andrew was highlighting and also Nitin was highlighting that like you were also referring to Levian's work, Michael Levian's work. So the kind of tools that were used, either it's land actioning or acquisitioning, these are the tools that makes one to draw parallels with Indian and Chinese model of urban development. But my question is about, so even in India, like the push for real estate is definitely there through subnational governments, but the real estate doesn't, it has a spatial configuration, right? Like it follows certain infrastructural corridors or industrial corridors. For instance, in Hyderabad, though there is a strong real estate push, it the real estate development is towards the west within the peri-urban region. So have you, so is there any such alignment, spatial alignment with either infrastructural corridors or industrial corridors, or did it change over the time where the real estate growth is, moving towards the spatial configuration of the real estate in the city regions?
So these are actually very closely linked questions in some sense. At the national scale, the Chinese government tried to promote development in Western China. So the early developing areas were in southeastern China, and then broadly along the eastern coast. And the Chinese government has tried progressively to push development further and further inland. And so it has promoted infrastructure development across the country and promoted pushing that infrastructure development further inland. Of course, the infrastructure development tends to happen first in the coast. The first subway systems were along the coast. The first high-speed railway linkages were connecting major coastal cities or connecting those to cities slightly further inland. And it's only in the past couple of years that really inland cities have developed spectacularly large infrastructure systems. But at this point, I mean, I was in Chengdu and in Kunming over the past couple of weeks, and they have very well-developed infrastructure systems at this point. These are cities that are quite far inland, and the effort to develop infrastructure to the west has been quite successful in that respect. At the more local level of sort of where exactly to go, this goes to your question about the sort of only being so much peri-urban to take advantage of. And so generally what happens is one local government will say they want to expand in this particular direction. So they want to go south, let's say. And so the municipal government will choose to go south, but a district government for one of the other districts will also have its own scheme. It will want to go a little west in its district because it wants to sell land too. Both the district and the municipal government are looking for ways to engage in this type of urban development. And then after building a chunk of this southern city, they may conclude that maybe it's time to go a different direction. Maybe a new leader comes into town and wants to have his own political accomplishments. Maybe they've finished building the southern city. It's now filled up and it's time to build another one. And so there's constantly moving around, but it tends not to happen in market-driven corridors. It tends to happen in heavily planned new city or new area developments in which the government draws a circle on a map and says, this is where development is going to occur. It connects it to the old town with a subway, and it provides all of the infrastructure that's needed for this to be a relatively self-sufficient and advanced town. And often it moves the municipal government or district government to this new area. It then pulls along all of the local schools and the like to the area, and so is able to pull along population simply by virtue of moving all of these attractions to the area. The question about industrial areas being converted to real estate uses. This is something I dodged talking about in the talk because it's a whole nother task of state building and local government and state-owned enterprise contention. State-owned enterprises were the primary holders of industrial land in most of these downtown areas. They held large amounts of industrial land, and local governments badly wanted control over it. And the only thing local governments really had going for them was that they could issue permits for construction, but they couldn't really take possession of land that was in the physical control of a state-owned enterprise that often outranked the local government in the political and administrative hierarchy. And so the process of industrial site redevelopment is a very contentious one in which different work units, the state-owned enterprise that has physical possession of the land and the municipal government that is in charge of the jurisdiction in which it sits, engage in extended, sometimes decade-long bargaining and try and work out an arrangement where both sides are satisfied with the profit they'll get and can engage in industrial redevelopment. But that type of industrial redevelopment is quite common. It used to involve simply leveling the old industrial sites, and now it's moved on to turning them into tourist sites and historical attractions. But it's nonetheless quite common. Indeed, as part of, even when this was functioning as an industrial policy tool, this was considered a useful form of industrial policy. You convert urban industrial developments into much higher value real estate land, and then you displace the lower value land use of industry to somewhere where they can use the profit from this higher value land use to pay for new structures. So this starts in the 1980s in Dalian, at least, and we see it extending across the country as a way to finance industrial upgrading, as well as a way to move these enterprises out of the city.
Yeah, sure. As long as you speak into the mic.
Just because it's interesting to learn from the comparative experience. I've been sort of in touch with Yiming Zhao, who sort of was in Zurich for a year, and he presented really interesting work on sort of state-led gentrification processes in China. So kind of density policies, but also creation of parks. And in India, there's this idea of bourgeois environmentalism, right? Creation of urban parks as well. Because it's in India that's sort of guided a lot by sort of bourgeois sensibilities and a sort of form of environmental activism that is led by citizens and goes through judiciary and all of that, but leads into similar kind of outcomes of cleaning up, sort of huge waterfronts and creating all this sort of very Western looking kind of environments, urban environments. But that same process is happening in China, but what's sort of driving it? Is there some sort of bourgeois environmentalism there? Or is it a sort of state process of gentrification, sort of trying to increase land rents in inner city areas, or what's driving that?
The latter. It raises land values, and from the perspective of the local government, it's a good investment. If you can, by building a park, dramatically increase the value of the land next to the park, then you might as well build a park. provided that the parkland itself doesn't consume so much land that it drives down the aggregate value of the land you can sell. So local governments are constantly doing this mental calculation about what they can do to drive up land values. Some of it is very explicit, but some of it is sort of just gut feeling that this is what will sell houses, and in particular for local government, sell land. Parth's got his hand up.
Partho.
But three things. So one, of course, Delhi, where you are, is the one place which was a landlord state until very recently, and still is, I think.
It was a what?
Was a landlord state.
Okay.
Because this was the one place where the state had monopoly over development on land, the Delhi Development Authority. So, and since then it's, yeah, and even after that, it's been doing the Chinese model, it auctions off land in particular ways. And so the private purchase of land is just about, I don't think much of that stuff has happened yet. Land pooling is supposed to happen, but it hasn't really taken off. So Delhi is an interesting sort of comparator case of the China story with now, so two, three kinds of tensions. I'm just curious about one, you mentioned right now about sort of land planning and how do you sort of get the maximum value of the land? How much is amenities? How much is structures? And obviously, if you're able to do an artificial lake and a park somewhere, it might generate more value from the remaining land than just selling the whole land by itself without the lake and the park. But in broad terms, let's say when I was in Shenyang, we will speak to the planning institute, and then you speak to the officials, and there is a tension between how the technical planners would like to see the city developed and how the mayor's office, which is sort of in charge of raising revenue and generating employment and so on and so forth, would like to see the city developed. And that then becomes also a point of negotiation, or is that just simply driven through by whatever the mayor wants, and the planning institutes just sort of cave in? If you can talk a little bit about how that sort of negotiation takes place. The second is this whole issue. I'm sad that Pushpa has had to leave. The whole issue of these informal settlements that you mentioned, and especially the urban villages and the development of these sites by the villagers themselves to provide the kind of, I mean, the ones I have been in around are like 7-story, which I think is the maximum we can go without elevators in China. Single bedroom kind of units with like very uniform blocks from place in place, but so they are not like how we would consider slums, but different from how we would consider urban villages in India, in the sense of the urban villages have a lot more, in India would have a lot more diversity in the architectural form, whereas there is pure efficiency on how to use space, right? And I'm just curious about how that capacity, both the technical approach and the capacity sort of come in to sort of have this very, nicely laid out street structures and so on and so forth, but very sort of very sort of almost brutalist blocks in some sense, structures going forward. And how that tension between developing those places versus the city, how the city looks at those kinds of developments in some senses. eventually then like in Gangxia and so on and so forth, you see some of them being erased and redeveloped and so on. But that is the second kind. The third is I'm curious about in this coalition, what is the benefit that that standard manufacturing units or get? Is it that because the local government is making a lot of money from the real estate that they are able to get cheaper land or that they get better infrastructure and so on and so forth? And is that why they sign up to be part of the coalition? I'm not quite clear as to what that sort of trade-off is.
Thank you for the history on Delhi, which I need to go learn more about. Manufacturing units aren't so much part of the growth coalition as they're sort of beneficiaries from the landlord state model, in that the government is just giving them very cheap land. So that is, yeah. But of course, the government is doing this because it trusts that they will then pay taxes. And so this is not as if the industrial enterprises are getting off scot-free. They are having to pay taxes in the end. So I suppose you've asked about two large-scale research endeavors here about how technocrats and the local government interact and how urban villages function. I'll start with the technocrats, I suppose. The technocrats, there's an enormous amount of tension between these urban planners and the political system above them. That's part of why the urban planners are put there in the first place. The idea is to have a bureau that will think about what's going on in the city development process, to put a little bit of a brake on what the party secretary or the mayor might want to do. And I don't think the party secretary and mayor are necessarily unfriendly to this concept. Some are quite happy to have somebody there to say, actually, this is really not a good long-term decision. This will undermine the overall value of the city. This will make the city unlivable. But there nonetheless is plenty of tension there. And the bargaining occurs differently in different cities. One thing that is relatively universal is that the local technocrats can lean on national standards. So one of the most binding rules in China, as far as I can tell, is the national standard on sunlight, which is sunlight. Which is that you are entitled on the winter solstice to a certain amount of time of sunlight on your bedroom window. And if you want to violate that, residents can raise a big fuss. And so this was, of course, written by urban planners at the national level in some moment of extremely conservative planning in which they thought standards could govern everything. But you have to keep in mind that China still has Soviet era ratios between populations and schools and the like, how much you're supposed to build of this public resource for
UDA.
The US certainly doesn't. So this is all part of that sort of broader structure of standards that exists from that era. And so local technocrats can lean on things like this and say, well, you can't just build housing, you have to build schools. You can't build the housing at that high a density because that'll block people's sunlight. And over the past couple of decades, something that you do not see in things in urban villages or things that Chinese build for themselves to live in, Chinese home buyers have come to expect sunlight and will not buy a place without sunlight. So if you look at Chinese houses, particularly if you say you went to Shenyang, in Shenyang, all of the houses face south. Nobody in northeastern China is willing to buy a house that doesn't face south. Everybody wants their hour or so of sunlight on the winter solstice, and you don't get that if you're facing north. So there's pressure from the market that these technocrats can leverage. And then there's just an enormous amount of politics that occurs within the bureaucracy. So the technocrats, of course, have their friends not necessarily in the mayor's office or the party secretary's office, but they have their friends in the provincial construction department. They have their friends in the National Ministry of Construction. And so they can call them up and ask for their help. And sometimes their friends in this system attempt to create institutions that will protect the planning bureaucrats. And so one of the more interesting ones is in Guangdong, where starting in Shenzhen and then ultimately through the work of the Guangdong Provincial Department of Construction, they established planning commissions in each city, where the mayor is the chair of the planning commission, and half of the planning commission is government officials, but the other half is required to be non-governmental planning experts. And of course, who are planning experts? They are people who are from the same background as the Urban Planning Bureau. They have many of the same proclivities as these planning technocrats. And so they serve as something of a brake on decisions that the mayor might want to make. And in the case of Guangdong, what they said was you can't change the planning restrictions on any parcel of land without a 2/3 vote of the planning commission, which meant that they needed the votes of some of the technically inclined members of the planning commission. So
it is not as if these planning commissions have banners from real estate funds as members of the.
Shenzhen, I believe, had at least one, but that's a little on the unusual side. Normally it's, I mean, the municipal governments aren't fools. They also attempt to choose people who won't block everything. So does that answer the question about technocrats? I mean, obviously, every single project has its own backstory of how the technocrats and the politicians interact, but that could be endless. The question of villages in the city, I think, may be best understood from a relatively historical perspective. Villages in the city in China started out with people building idiosyncratic houses that served their personal preferences. In the early 1980s, there was a huge housing boom in rural China. This was coming off of the planned economy. They were moving away from collective farming and towards much, much more productive decollectivized farming, and households simply had the money all of a sudden to engage in housing construction, and they did, with the support of the national government. And so a lot of houses were built that had some personality at that point. And then things began to get a little bit more complicated in the early 1990s. And so let's take Shanghai and Guangzhou as a comparison. In the early 1990s, they established Pudong as this new development area in Shanghai. And Deng Xiaoping tells the founding officials in charge of Pudong that they should really go and visit Guangdong, they should visit Fujian, they should visit the places that have already been opened up to the outside world, learn how to do it. And so they go to Guangdong and they go to Fujian and they come back and say, well, those folk in Guangdong should have taken land earlier. They waited far too long, and it's now impossible to take land because there are all these urban villages dotting the landscape in Guangdong. And so they decide that they will take all the land in Pudong and they will do it fast and early. And so the area around Bujiazui, the area around the financial center in Pudong, they took all the land from the get-go. And they prevented the emergence of villages in the city. And in the areas of Shanghai where they didn't take the land immediately, they told them they couldn't build any new houses. So if you look at the age distribution of village houses in Shanghai, they are overwhelmingly from the 1980s. There are a few from 1990, and then there are none from afterwards, essentially. So they simply froze these in time. And as a result, migrant workers in Shanghai don't live in urban villages because that's not an option. There simply isn't much housing capacity in these urban villages. If you look at Guangzhou, on the other hand, the mayor of Guangzhou, who was appointed in 1990 as well, looks at Guangzhou when he arrives. He's previously the party secretary of Shunde, which is a very successful county just south of Guangzhou. And he arrives in Guangzhou and he says, this place is in bad shape, and decides that it needs a shot in the arm economically, and he goes and travels around the country. He travels to Shanghai, among other places, but he also travels to Dongguan, and he decides that Dongguan, which is an export processing zone just north of Shanghai, just north of Shenzhen, that is even less planned than Shenzhen, is a good model for Guangzhou, that they need to recruit investment the way that Dongguan does, that they need to build housing the way that Dongguan does. And so he encourages villages in the city to engage in construction. He hands the authority to approve construction down the hierarchy. And when villages are having land taken, what he does is he provides them with a percentage of land as compensation. So they get to keep a certain chunk of their land that they are permitted to build supposedly industrial structures on, but everybody seems to turn the other way when they actually build housing on this. And so many of those villages that you go to in the Pearl River Delta, the ones that have very orderly street networks and the like, are the result in, be it in Shenzhen or Guangzhou or in Dongguan or in any of these cities, of the local government saying, here you have 10% of your original agricultural land that you can use for construction. You should use it for industry. And then the village instead turns it into housing land, plans roads for people to have some access to their houses, slices it up into individual parcels, and allows the villagers to build their own houses. This way, the village doesn't need to put any money into the project, and the villagers individually pay for all of the housing. And so you get very orderly villages. So if you go to these Shenzhen urban villages, the urban village that has people living in it, both the original villagers and the migrant workers, is perhaps this 7-story structures. Some cases it's 20-story structures where they have put in an elevator. And then behind it is an old village where not necessarily anybody lives at all, because it's not really very comfortable to live in. It's old houses that date back at least to the 1980s, sometimes earlier. And it's not planned. The roads go in winding fashion, and it's much lower density. And so this conversion to much higher density and much more planned urban villages is the result of governments that were not necessarily endorsing urban villages as a development form, but were certainly facilitating it, and didn't necessarily see it as a problem.
And so the Guangdong model was sort of adopted more widely across different cities of the Pearl River, in southern China, across other places.
So the Pearl River sort of developed this model from constantly studying one another. But then the rest of China, it's varied. Certainly in the Yangtze River Delta, you have a number of cities that are, it's unclear whether they learned from Shanghai or whether they had the same proclivities as Shanghai. They would go to Guangdong and simply be outraged by the disorder that they saw. But then places that didn't have the type of capital that Shanghai had, didn't have the access to money to simply take everybody's land up front, we're often quite happy to adopt this Pearl River Delta model, in which you don't need money. You don't have to provide that much money to a village if you're going to tell it that it can have a windfall off of suddenly becoming an urban village where they can build housing for migrant workers. You simply tell them, here's the land you get to keep, and we will provide infrastructure surrounding it. We will provide a city, which will provide demand for jobs, and all you have to do is just wait. And so it's much cheaper as a land taking strategy. Even if you do provide money, you're only paying for taking people's agricultural land, which is under the Chinese land system quite cheap. And you don't have to pay for taking their residential land, in which case you probably have to provide them a new house, which costs a lot of money.
And this is a negotiation that takes place between the local government and the village government in that.
In some cases, between real estate developers and the villages, but the local government is constantly
Mediating.
or if not mediating, it's aware of what's going on and it's trying to coordinate.
In the
with it.
know.
Yeah.
Yes, that's a different process from what happens in many places around here, but that'd be fine. Yes, so
Yeah, I think lots of food for thought, lots to chew on. Yeah, so Surajit was asking, I don't know whether Surajit is still here. Let me first check. He is. Hi, Surajit. I'm going to get you into the talk if you want to talk, but essentially his question is there a contribution to theory here or a useful lesson for the global South? I mean, seems to be a good place to end.
I'm a political scientist and not a public policy person, so I'm going to be very cautious in answering this question. From a theory perspective, I think what's useful is that it's helpful to recognize that industrial policy isn't always accomplished through tariffs and the like, or through financial repression and the use of capital as a way to subsidize industry. It's sometimes accomplished through essentially the land equivalent of this. The useful lesson for the global South, I think I will leave for others to derive, and I'll be curious what people have as lessons, but I'm not going to venture one.
All right. So Rajit, you're in the room and you can unmute yourself and say something if you want to respond to that.
Oh, no, I enjoyed the talk very much. Thank you. And I take the answer. Thanks. Thanks a lot.
All right. Thanks.
Thank
Rajit.
you.
So thank you. Thank you so much, Saul. And thank you for everyone who's still in the room, online and offline. And